Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age. Got a great show for you tonight. This is a story about two families in suburban St. Louis. And one family bullied the daughter of the other family by making up characters or a character on the net that resulted, or at least thereafter, the daughter of the family who was being bullied committed suicide. And we want to take a look at all the parties in this case and try to answer the question, who's to blame? And to discuss this question with us tonight is Ben Wizner, an ACLU lawyer who is, I would say, an online child expert because he's been a lawyer for the ACLU in the Children's Online Protection Act case. Now, I have to tell you, members of the audience, that this case is one of the great First Amendment victories. It's gone back and forth to the Supreme Court. ACL always wins, so thanks, Ben, for coming by.
Very glad to be here. Thanks,
Okay,
Jim.
and I think what we ought to do to tell the story to the audience is get the cast of characters straight. We've got the Drews, who are the next-door neighbors. Not exactly next door, but close by. And then we got the Meiers, and they all live in this suburban area. And the Drews have a daughter, and they have an employee of the wife, the Drew wife, Mrs. Drew. They're on one side of this particular incident. And then we have the Meiers, and we have Megan Meier. And Megan Meier is the one who commits suicide. And then we have Josh Evans. Now, who's Josh Evans?
Well, somebody, nobody, it's hard to say. But I think the story has to start with this 13-year-old girl, Megan Meier, who's a very troubled 13-year-old girl, had a history of depression, had been as a child prescribed psychotropic medications, had perhaps attempted suicide earlier in her life, although that's not certain. Evidently, she and the daughter of the Drews had once been friends, and as the story is told, Megan decided not to be friends with this other girl across the street. And for whatever reason, this other family, the Drews, decided to create a fictional online character named Josh Evans on MySpace to befriend Megan, and according to the Drews, to find out whether she was bad-mouthing their daughter, or possibly, to put a worse light on it, to harass and intimidate Megan.
And so this character they created, Josh Evans, what did he do? Why did he get everyone so upset, or not well, he's got everyone upset now because I don't think anyone's happy with the result.
Well, he arrived at 13-year-old Megan's MySpace page, identified himself as a new homeschooled kid in town, sent a photo of himself as a handsome 16-year-old boy, said that he was attracted to brown-haired girls and he didn't care about weight. He was too good to be true in every way. And they struck up an online correspondence and via their MySpace pages and communicated with each other every day for something like a month.
So a MySpace account works basically that you sign up with MySpace and then you let certain people come in as your friends. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's what's called a social networking site. So that if you have a MySpace page, you might get requests from other people with MySpace pages to be their friends, and then they appear on your page as Ben's friends or Jim's friends. You can have an open account, which means that anyone with a MySpace page, and these are now maybe tens of millions of people, can request to be your friend. Or, as in the case of Megan, you can have a closed MySpace account where you can only approach the user through other people who are known to you. And one question in this case is, given that it was a closed account, how is it that Megan's parents allowed this scenario to get as far as it did?
Yeah, I think we ought to talk about that, because one of the interesting connections between the case that you've had for so long, the Children's Online Protection Act case, which we call COPA, is that issue also involves parental supervision. We'll talk about that in a sec. But looking at this case in terms of the parents, we've got the parents of two 13-year-old kids. How would you describe the activities of the parents? Let's say start off with Megan.
Well, first we have to, I think, be a little clear about what happened in this case. which is that, after a month of corresponding with this handsome stranger named Josh Evans, all of a sudden things turned quite sour. He became very hostile to her. Finally, his last message was, "The world would be a better place without you." Following which, she retreated to her room and hanged herself with a leather belt in her closet. It emerged later that, as I said, this Josh Evans had been a creation of the neighbors. And so there has been a massive reaction to this story, with people saying that we need some kind of new law or regulation to govern these kinds of activities. The question is, what is the role of the parents here? Well, on one level, from the side of the Druze, this is a pretty simple story of cruelty. These were parents acting like children, getting involved in the social squabbles of 13-year-olds in a way that was absolutely inappropriate and possibly even dangerous. From the point of view of the Meiers, Megan's parents, this is a reminder that parents have to know their own children. I'm quite sure that there are millions of 13-year-old children who can quite safely take care of themselves on MySpace and anywhere else. And then there are kids who can't. A kid who has a history of psychiatric illness, a kid who has real social problems, that kid might need a little bit more parental attention and maybe should not have been left unsupervised in this world.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the case from that angle, and we look at this poor 13-year-old. First of all, she begged her parents to go on MySpace. She was only 13. You're supposed to be 5. You're supposed to be 14 before you go on. She begged to go on. She couldn't go on. She then went over to the Drew family, with the girl who was her enemy, I guess, ultimately, and snuck on. Then she goes back to her parents, begs again, and the parents say that, okay, you can have a MySpace account, but number one, we've got to be there when you use it. Number two, you've got to keep it private. 3, you can't give your password out.
Right.
And I think there were some other conditions. The thing that struck me about this case is that the parents seemed to try to do everything they could. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, I think they certainly, according to what I've read, they tried. And they set reasonable rules. You're 13 years old, you should not be on this account if we're not in the room. What perhaps they didn't know is that there are technologies available that would have allowed them to enforce that without being there. And that most of the major software companies have parental control software that would have prevented her from even signing on to the account without the parent doing it for them, or except at certain times of day. These parental controls are getting more and more sophisticated and user-friendly, and this is a case where those controls might have averted what actually happened.
I'm glad you mentioned parental controls, because that's the big issue in this case that you've had so long. And this case involves material that is inappropriate for children. What is the magic word, in fact?
Well, the magic word continues to change. And this case goes back to the dawn of the digital age, or perhaps the dawn of the internet era. And you had this internet that was appearing, and a bunch of very sophisticated kids and bewildered adults. And the adults became very concerned that the internet was just going to be a sea of pornography, and it was going to be a way for kids to get around those colored wrappers that you have in magazine stores. And so Congress enacted a very crude statute called the Communications Decency Act, which basically said that any material that was indecent could not be online. It could be a crime to place it online. And thus began a decades-long struggle between the ACLU and the Department of Justice. But basically, there is a pattern of crude and overbroad interventions
by the government,
out of some very well-intentioned concerns about keeping certain kinds of material away from children. So the Communications Decency Act was struck down. And remember, the government insists that these laws are intended to ban pornography online, but pornography has no legal meaning. obscenity is the legal term.
So the children won, in a sense, in this first case.
You know what? But we would say the adults won.
The adults won because
the problem with
they
this
were
kind
being
of
kept out.
That's right.
Yeah.
The problem with these kinds of regulations is that in the name of protecting children, they would have turned the entire internet into a big sandbox. You know, and we weren't representing pornographers, we were representing salon.com. I mean, there are plenty of very mainstream publications that have sexually explicit conduct that has value for adults and even for some older minors. The new catchphrase is harmful to minors.
Oh, that's the magic word.
Right, right. So when the Supreme Court, there's a great story about this, which is that when this case made its way to the Supreme Court, none of the 9 justices had ever seen the internet before. And so they gathered around the computer of one of the law clerks to be shown what the internet was.
Did they really?
Here they were deciding what's been called, the Magna Carta of the internet age. This was the most important decision. Had they ruled the other way, the internet would look very different today than it does right now.
So
they really opened it up.
So it went back to Congress, and Congress came up with a new catchphrase, and the case started all over again, right?
Started all over again.
And
Their
how
new
did you win?
catchphrase was that material that is harmful to minors.
Right.
But once again, Congress tried to refine the definition. They tried to narrow the categories of materials that would still be criminalized. But again, I mean, we won with the same strategy, which is that we brought some very valuable online content creators. Let me give you an example. We represent an entity called the Sexual Health Network. This is a website that provides information about sex to people with physical disabilities. Very important, quite explicit, and very important for them that they be able to provide that material online for free. So again, the courts, in this case it's been twice to the Supreme Court already, said this is once again too overbroad. Once again, you're trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And you won it with filters, though, didn't you?
Our argument was that rather than essentially getting all of this material off the internet, there was a better solution, which is that parents who chose to could get filtering software that would protect their own children while letting your children or someone else's children see what they need to see.
So what's interesting about your experience and the fact that you had come up with the filtering solution is that a few minutes ago, that was your solution in this case. So let me just push you a little bit
Sure.
on filters. It's a very good argument, and it's a great First Amendment victory. But in the real world, as you implied, does anyone get filters?
They do.
I mean, isn't this an ACL theory that has no place in practice?
No, I mean, now I will say that the V-chips in televisions may just be an argument in a brief somewhere. I don't think anybody's really using their V-chips, although they're available to block content. Filters are quite different. And actually, filters are very widely used now in society, and increasingly
used. Are
used.
they hard for parents to buy?
Quite simple to buy, and
Really?
in fact, almost all new software programs come with filters. You don't even need to buy filters separately anymore.
A software program.
In
What
other
do
words,
you mean
if
by
you
software
get
program?
Microsoft Word or whatever their new, not
It has a
Microsoft Word,
filter
if you
on it?
get Windows, it has a very simple filtering system called Vista. You press a few buttons. It's quite easy to use, and we had expert testimony about this. The argument isn't that filters are perfect. The argument is that they're available and they allow people to make these decisions for themselves and their own families rather than having the government make it for all families.
Well, do you think the Meyers knew about the analog filter program that was available for them to stop MySpace?
I suspect that the Meyers had filtering software on their computers to block pornography or things like that.
Didn't know about it.
No, and maybe they used it. And maybe they used it, but there would have been, for example, a technology that would have allowed them to set the specific hours of the day that their 13-year-old could use the computer, so that, in addition to having rules, they could actually enforce them. So
how would the filtering? I understood you to say at the beginning that the filtering would have stopped MySpace altogether. Now that this girl is in MySpace, the filtering works there? No, it wouldn't have stopped. It wouldn't have stopped Josh Evans from being created.
Well, see, you could block MySpace altogether as a parent if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But you could do something very different, which is you could control the hours of the day that your child is online. And that would have been, for parents who want to make sure that they are present when their kids are using the computer, you can say only between 4 and 6 p.m. can my child even be on the computer at all.
Okay, but let me ask you, do you really think I understand that's theoretically a very good argument, but in this case, all those rules were set up.
Yeah.
Megan went down to the computer down in the basement, okay? And the parent didn't go with the child. Now, if I'm a parent, and I'm bringing up kids, to spend 2 hours sitting and watch my kid doing a computer is not something that I would ordinarily do. In fact, the more I think about it, I've talked myself into thinking that's highly theoretical. No parent would do that.
We have gotten ahead of ourselves here.
We've gotten ahead of ourselves in
we
this
need
conversation?
we need to take a few steps back here.
Okay.
Because we have started this conversation with the premise that there is a problem that needs to be solved.
Right.
And so we've already gotten to solutions.
We got to one solution, parental
What's the
solution.
problem that needs to be solved? Now, I read the newspaper, and I look at stories like this. There is not an epidemic of MySpace teen suicides, right? And I think we need to be very careful about choosing a strategy, a tragedy, looking at a real tragedy, and then deciding that we need to change social policy to respond to an individual tragedy here. I mean, we know that lightning comes out of the sky, but we don't walk around with lightning rods sticking out of our briefcases because of this. And so the first question has to be, is MySpace this terrible threat to 13-year-olds, or is this one of those stories that could have happened with or without the internet? And I really think that the kind of reaction that there's been to this is in some ways typical of Americans who claim that they don't like lawyers and don't like the law, but every time some kind of tragedy occurs, they look immediately for a legal solution to it. My first point here is that law is a blunt instrument.
Right.
And there may not be a legal solution to the kind of tragedy that happened in this case.
Well, I want to talk about that precisely, but I thought I had you on the ropes a little bit on the parental stuff, and you slipped away into the...
I'm happy to go back to the ropes if you think so. Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, to pick up on the point you made, that implying that it could have happened in a situation other than the internet.
Right.
Whether the internet has certain characteristics that are very difficult to deal with from anyone's point of view. I mean, we had a show here about 2 Yale law students who got libeled on the net, and the net of the net was that no one could figure out how one could protect those students. Right. And so therefore, one wonders, with respect to the net, just generally speaking, if it's sort of the Wild West of speech. And you end up with these situations because of the inability to sort of sensibly deal with it in terms of your own human behavior,
right,
such as being required to sit 2 hours watching your
I think that the internet is requiring all of us to change our expectations about the validity and reliability of information. And so, what I would say about these kinds of situations on MySpace where some too good to be true stranger appears on the screen is that maybe people need to start assuming that someone who is a stranger is an invention. And that should be their presumption unless they weren't otherwise. I mean, that this is one of the things that the net allows, is for people to appear anonymously as other people. And I think parents want to teach their children that someone who appears who they don't know almost certainly is an invention. When it comes to things like libel, I think all of us now, looking at a website with anonymous, nasty comments about somebody, would give those a lot less credence than if they appeared in the New York Times or in a published magazine, because we know that it's possible for people to write whatever they want on the internet. So I do think that it is thrusting us into new situations, but we also have to have different responses.
Well, before we get to some more precise ways of dealing with this, I think what you're suggesting there is that at least with respect to the Megan Meier situation, we ought to have parents who are really hip to the dangers of creating fictional people on the net. I think it's don't you think
again, if we think it's a real danger, and I'm not sure it is. I don't think that a mentally ill 13-year-old tragically committing suicide is evidence that there is a real problem, that children are in danger from anonymous strangers on the internet. So I want to start there. I'm not persuaded that this is a crisis before we start talking about solutions. Maybe you can persuade me. I'm not persuaded that there's an epidemic out there of adults damaging children by appearing in certain forms of them. And you see these sting programs on television where adults are lured thinking that they're going to have sex with 13-year-olds, and then they get gang tackled by police in driveways. I still don't think that there is an epidemic problem here that requires some massive social intervention.
Well, just a matter of social policy. If we have kids, don't we want kids to be themselves? I mean, when kids are growing up, there's a difficulty in figuring out what your persona is. I don't think that's helped, or at least I would argue that's not particularly helped, by creating another persona to make believe and do whatever it's going to do to the person who receives that image.
Let me make a counter argument
Yes,
here.
go ahead.
For the importance and dignity of anonymity online. Let's say that this 13-year-old, rather than being mentally ill, was questioning her sexuality and thought that she might not be straight, and had parents who were very conservative, parents who she couldn't speak to about this, and wanted to get information about this. I can see the real value of creating a persona so that that child could go and get information to help her without having to reveal who she is in a community where she might be ostracized or punished for having those feelings. So I don't think anonymous online personas are necessarily a social evil. I think in some cases they're really quite necessary, and one of the great benefits of the internet. When I was 13 years old, if I had wanted to ask questions like that, there was no simple place I could turn without revealing my identity. Now there is.
Okay, well, let's talk more particularly now on who's to blame. And we started talking about the legal part, and I set you back to the parental part. One of the suggestions that has been made by legislators who've worried about this type of situation is that the type of speech that we have here, bullying speech, that ought to be subject to some legal definition. In fact, one would pass a law making it illegal to bully somebody else online. And I suppose it's that type of idea, at least, that's made the First Amendment community a little upset about the furor that this case has caused. But what do you think if we had such a law?
Well, again, I mean, I always say when people propose these online laws, should the rules be different online than they are offline? There are already certain kinds of bullying speech offline that cross the line into harassment and can be illegal, depending on how extreme it is and depending on the circumstances. I don't see why the rules for harassment need to be different online than they are offline in the real world, where bullying is, in many communities, a real social epidemic and does require adult interventions. So that's always my first response is, what is it about the internet that creates the expectations in people that the government is going to control human behavior in ways that it doesn't off the internet?
Well, it's interesting. These harassment rules are probably in every state, do you think?
I would guess that every state has a criminal harassment rule. Yeah.
Well, I wonder in this, in this particular case, it's sort of interesting what the Meiers did with respect to the law and the government, because Mrs. Meier called the local police and said, "Do you think there really is such a person as Josh Evans?" So she was reaching out for some state intervention, and then the district attorney, I guess, in the local area decided no law applied. Do you think he looked at? I mean, you don't know, but do you think he looked at that?
No, I think he looked at the actual conduct, and what happened here? Was it harassment? You had a family create a fictitious character. He pretended to be friendly for 29 days, and on the 30th day, he said, "I don't like you anymore. The world would be better without you." That doesn't strike me as criminal harassment. That strikes me as very cruel behavior. But we can't have legal solutions to all the ways in which people aren't kind to one another. And I think that in 999 cases out of 1,000, it wouldn't have ended with a girl hanging by the neck.
Well, what do you think about the combined behavior of the parents of the next door neighbors, the Drews? The Drews there were two Drews. There was Miss Drew, and then Mrs. Drew had one of her employees, all a part of this. Lawyers like to think the word conspiracy, but I won't use it. Part of it.
No.
Does that behavior, shall we say, generally speaking, so we don't have to talk about the Drews particularly,
right,
that type of behavior should go unpunished, do you think?
Depends what they're doing.
Well, they created this Josh Evans who didn't exist.
Sure, and if all he had ever said to this girl were nice things, we wouldn't be talking about harassment. The fact that there's 8 adults who created a fictional character and who are communicating with a 13-year-old is seedy, it's creepy, it's strange. But whether or not it's harassment depends on the content of the communications and what it is that they were communicating with her, not on who was doing it.
It doesn't make any difference what they did.
Not to me. Well, no, it makes a big difference what they did. Again, what they said.
Yeah.
It's
not how they. It's not how they put it together, but it's the speech itself you have to look at. So we've now exonerated a lot of the people in generally the participants in this sort of thing. Let's think about MySpace. Okay. Now, MySpace is the progenitor of all this. Without MySpace,
Right.
we wouldn't have this sort of thing. Now, MySpace has a rule that you can't go on until you're 14. And the girls in this case were not, quotes, legal age. Is there some responsibility on the part of people who have these type of sites, so to speak, and on behalf of society, generally speaking, to police, the rules with respect to age?
This is a difficult question
That's why
because I
to.
think that the answer is if there were a requirement that MySpace actively police content, there couldn't really be a MySpace. There could be something else, but it couldn't be MySpace. You couldn't have tens of millions of users communicating freely the way they do with a staff of a few hundred. This issue has come up in litigation against Craigslist, which also allows users to post listings of various kinds and different information. Craigslist has been sued by civil rights groups under fair housing laws because people who are posting apartments on Craigslist sometimes say, I only want a female roommate.
Just for the audience, I mean, Craigslist and MySpace are the same as they're operating sites.
Exactly right.
They're saying in the case of Craigslist, I'm operating, but they're really saying I'm not responsible for it.
Now, what Craigslist said
Craigslist is saying, effectively, the law doesn't make me responsible for it, right?
Right, although what Craigslist said in response to this lawsuit is not buzz off, we're not responsible, but, we can't possibly police all the content that's posted on the site. But if you let us know, if you have a way of reporting to us that something is discriminatory, we'll take it down. I think MySpace probably does the same already, that they have a mechanism for people to report very inappropriate material that's posted, and they will remove it.
Okay,
Whether
so
they have an ability to actually police the amount of content that is posted and generated on that site, I think it's not possible.
Okay, we've come to the end.
Yeah.
We've dealt with all the possible parties. So what's the answer to the question? Who's to blame?
Well, you can ask a question like this every time a 13-year-old girl takes her own life. You can say society's to blame, the family's to blame. You can say no one's to blame, and there are going to be tragedies in this world. What I would say is we shouldn't be so quick to rush from a tragedy like this to a change in the law without really very carefully thinking through the consequences.
Ben Wizner, great pleasure. Thank you for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
And thank you for coming by. And come by next week and learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I am James Goodale. Good night. Have a good week.